Here we are in our compassion class, and our marketing and communications team came up with this beautiful graphic. It is the statue of St. Francis at the cathedral, and he brought so much compassion to all that he did. So I love that they chose that for us. An opening quote for us is from Rainer Maria Rilke. I live my life in widening circles that reach out across the world. I may not ever complete the last one, but I give myself to it. It makes me think of a stone being dropped into a pond and the circles that go out concentrically, and that's what we hope to do with our compassion and all that we can bring to the world. So, what is compassion? Is from the Latin word. The two parts are cum and pati. Cum is with, and pati is to suffer. I have not taken Latin, so I apologize if I pronounce that wrong. Um, but it is literally suffering with, but we'll get even deeper into what that means. So, one of the questions that I found in some of my books is, where does it hurt? Compassion asks us to go where it hurts, to enter into the places of pain, to share in the brokenness, fear, confusion, and anguish. Compassion challenges us to cry out with those in misery, to mourn with those who are lonely, to weep with those in tears. Compassion requires us to be weak with the weak, vulnerable with the vulnerable, and powerless with the powerless. Compassion means full immersion into the condition of being human. And that's from an older book. My husband was making fun of me earlier. I have stacks and stacks of books everywhere. So this is an older book on compassion. Um, you can tell this was written, I think, in the 70s or early 80s by Henri Nouwen, Donald McNeil, and Douglas Morrison. They got together and talked with people across many different fields and areas and compiled this book together. And it's got a lot of really great wisdom. And I love that the book starts with, "Whoo, it is a tough climate. Everything is going in shambles. The turn of the century is in 20 years, and what is there left to hope for?" Uh, here we are 20 years past that, 25 years past that, and we might still say the same thing. Let's see. Yeah. Okay. Compassion versus empathy. See, here it is. I think it was Carrie who asked for this. So, compassion is not the same as empathy or altruism or sympathy. That was in a different. But the concepts are all related. So, empathy refers to our ability to take the perspective and feel the emotions. So, if you think of kind of a deepening of emotion, at the top is going to be sympathy, like, oh, I feel so bad for you. But you're not engaging any emotions. You can see something that happened and it stinks, and you're like, oh, you send the heart or you send the prayer hands, but you're not really engaging. And then you go down that next level to empathy. And that's where you're starting to say, okay, well, what does that feel like for me? And you're internalizing it to yourself and saying, okay, well, I think I understand that, or I can maybe imagine that. And so that's where the empathy is. And then altruism kind of goes with that. It's the selfless behavior prompted by feelings of compassion or empathy, but you don't have to have it, they don't have to mirror each other necessarily. And as I was doing all of my research, and I can't remember the word, but there's a Japanese word that talks about this altruism, this self-giving, but it's not born out of compassion. And so I didn't want to use it as an example, but I think it was the Japanese team had won some sort of like world soccer or rugby or some sort of competition. And instead of, rushing the field and celebrating like you might do in America, they all get up and clean the stadium. And that's wonderful. It's built into their culture, but it's not compassion. So, compassion is that final level as we're going from kind of our head, just thinking about things, down to our heart, and then really into our body, thinking about really feeling the emotions, not how it would feel just for ourselves, but how is this going to feel for another? How is it feeling in their bodies, in their hearts, in their minds, and then taking action. So that I hope that helps to delineate those three different concepts. Yeah, so contributing to relief efforts for those hurting from the results of the storm. Yes, exactly, Allison. Was it Friday night, Saturday night when we heard about just the great destruction? And for me, Western North Carolina hits really close to home because I grew up in North Carolina. I lived there 30 years, and know tons and tons of people in Western North Carolina. And just to see the pictures, it's just, yes. And we're going to talk about this, and I felt it deep, deep within my body. So, and then I was reading more and I'm like, oh yeah, that's compassion. So you guys are spot on. So tonight we're really going to talk about three-centered compassion. And we started our time together with some meditation, really feeling things in our bodies, in our hearts, and in our minds, in our heads. So given these three, head, heart, and body, where do you think about compassion? Where do you feel that in your body or think about it? So what of those three centers does compassion trigger for you? You can put it in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself and throw out heart. Yeah, lots of hearts. Okay, heart and body. Yeah, heart, heart, heart. So I came to this class. So I've taught a class on compassion before, which is again what led me to, oh, head, Jennifer, we might have to, I'm curious. Um, I have done a lot of work and it's all been very heart-centered. And so I'm thinking like, oh, we're gonna do all this heart work. We're gonna do all this heart work. Janice, yeah, and the body and the gut. And then the more I've been reading and reading and reading, it's really all three places. And we need all three places. And so while a lot of it does come from our heart, we're gonna activate all three centers of knowing. But we will start with the head. All right, so compassion in the brain. So maybe you've heard some about this. I was telling my family about this at dinner time tonight, and my son who's in sixth grade, is like, "Oh, we talk about this in advisory. We talk about our feelings and how the brain works." I'm like, "Great, you already know it." He was not as excited. So I have a picture of a brain here, and I am not a neurologist or a doctor or any kind of medical professional. So if you know these fields well, please forgive me for getting anything wrong. This is, the very basic surface level understanding. So the parts that are lit up here are the limbic system of our brain. These are the earliest parts of the brain to form. And then if you see, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but this outer part of the brain, this is our cortex and it was formed later. So I'm going to make a fist like this, and the screen is reversed. I'm having trouble with this. So if I make a fist like this, I've got my thumb tucked inside. This is the limbic system. This is my brainstem. This is my spinal cord. This is the cortex. So this last kind of knuckle down here, this is the prefrontal cortex. And if you squeeze everything together, it's that prefrontal cortex that joins it all together, that helps to integrate everything. Now, when we get triggered, when someone says something or we encounter something, and you feel it. We talked about this in the Braving in the Wilderness class that everything rises up, your breath gets short. We've heard the expression flipping your lid. Well, this is what happens. Bink, your cortex goes offline. So your limbic system, this is the unconscious thought. This is doing the reacting. And so we have to take steps to reconnect ourselves, to use our whole brains and not just our survival brain here. So one way that we can think about that, this is using Joseph Campbell's circle of awareness. Maybe you're familiar with that, but there above the line is our presence. Things that you're aware of, things that you consciously know you're doing as I'm moving my hands and talking. And then below that level are the things that I'm not aware of, the breathing, the keeping myself sitting up, things like that. And throughout the day, we have our reactions, our hormonal things. The goal, and you see that line. Now, it's always going to be the line. There are going to be a lot more things that we are not aware of than things that we are, just in terms of how our bodies work. But there are choices in there. So the more we can raise above that line into presence, into awareness, the more we can come out of this trance state. Have you ever been on autopilot? You get in the car and you start driving and you say, wait a second, how did I get here? Or you start driving and all of a sudden you realize, I was going to work and I needed to go to church today, and those are different directions. Those are the trance states. And what can happen is if we're not doing the practices that raise us up into presence, when we're in that trance state, we're reacting out of our limbic brain, we're much more reactionary, and we don't have as much control over what's going on inside of us and as much control over our reactions. So trance is unconscious, below the line, kind of asleep or in a dream, possessed by emotions, disassociated. You might, I've heard people talk about saying, oh, I feel like I'm observing myself. I don't feel like I'm in my body. I feel like I'm watching everything that's happening. Uh, you might remember from the Brene Brown Heart Defended when we have those barriers up, or maybe it's just numb. And that's when we're reactive to experience and we're grasping at things or resisting. So if we switch to presence, it means that we're up above that line. We're wakeful, lucid, and aware, and we can witness our emotions mindfully, where we have more control over them. We don't react quite as strongly when our children are being poopy heads. Um, we can be in contact with our feelings and not in control, or have our feelings in control of us. And our hearts are caring and tender. We can be responsive to experience, balanced, open, and discerning. So, this is something someone was talking about: what fires together wires together. Neuropsychologist Donald Hebb first used this phrase in 1949 to describe how pathways in the brain are formed and reinforced through repetition. And our brains can be changed through spiritual practice. And I mean, we think of spiritual practice as, oh, I'm meditating, I'm journaling, I'm doing these things set apart. But it can also translate into actual practice. And even just 5 minutes a day can rewire our brains. And the more that we work on it, the more they're going to be rewired. We often think about brains being wired through trauma. And if I know that trauma is very real in far too many lives. And so I'm not a trained psychologist, and trained psychologists and psychiatrists can help with that, but these are additional practices that can help to transfer that trauma and rewire those neurons. So before we move on to the heart, any thoughts on compassion in the brain? I learned a lot of that, or had it kind of re-emphasized in a new way for me through some of the reading I was doing.
I did have a question. So you mentioned, you know, the brain can be changed through spiritual practice. What would be some examples of that? I know prayer, but are there others? How would that work?
Yes. So depending on time, we might not have a huge amount of time to do spiritual practice together today, but in upcoming classes, we're going to have a lot more time and focus on
Okay,
practice. So you're going to have plenty of practices to work with. Uh,
okay, okay.
yeah,
Thank you.
that's a great question. Being present to someone suffering is a conscious choice. Yes, it actually is. Sometimes we don't think about that. And we might have less of a choice depending on who's around us, and if we need to respond immediately. But it is a conscious choice. There are people in the world who, you know, can see what's happening and people suffering and not be moved. So yeah, one of the books, I can't remember which one, I think it was the compassion book, talked about, is compassion fundamental to being human? And the answer is yes and no. It is. It is part of our wiring. It is part of our socialization, even in the earliest days. But it is also something that has to be cultivated. And if we focus on power and prestige and security over communication and connection, then we lose that compassion piece. So, all right, moving on to in the heart. From Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh, if you have not suffered, you don't see the suffering of people or other living beings. You would not have the love in you, nor would you understand what it is to love. Uh, no one wants to suffer, but suffering is a part of everyone's life. And if we take that, it actually helps us to be more present and more compassionate. Joan said it's hard to see suffering yet still remain calm when needed. It can be. It can be. And that's where these practices will help you. And as we talked about in the Braving the Wilderness class, anger has a place. Just because you're angry doesn't mean you're not compassionate. The two can go hand in hand. It's when the anger lives in you rather than being transformed into action and more compassion. Um, So Sharon Salzberg does a lot of work in the compassion and meditation space, and she says it's not at all weak. It's the strength that arises out of seeing the true nature of suffering in the world. Compassion allows us to bear witness to that suffering, whether it's in ourselves or others, without fear. It allows us to name injustice without hesitation and to act strongly with all the skill at our disposal. That is such a powerful quote to me. And if we think about the people who are both the most compassionate and the world changers, we're thinking of people like Gandhi and Mother Teresa and Martin Luther King Jr. They have boundless compassion that they have translated into world changing. So compassion is not at all weak. And finally, from Henri Nouwen, compassion is hard because it requires the inner disposition to go with others to the place where they are weak, vulnerable, lonely, and broken. In solitude of heart, in solitude, our heart of stone can be turned into a heart of flesh, a rebellious heart into a contrite heart, and a closed heart into a heart that can open itself to all suffering people in a gesture of solidarity. So, in this book, he talks a lot about showing up, about what can happen in the silence and just with presence. So often we think we do have to do something, but simply showing up can be a great ministry of compassion. Oh, Beryl said Jimmy Carter. Yeah, he's another one who lives that great compassion. And today's his birthday. He's 100 years old. So that's a good celebration.
Are there books that we can get to really get into this? I'm
Yeah.
sorry I'm late, but I couldn't get in.
Oh no, I'm so sorry, Marilyn. Um, yes, I am going to have I have an extensive bibliography and series of website links that I want to share with you all. So never fear.
Good.
But yes, I have stacks and stacks of books all around me. My husband was joking with me earlier. He's like, "You need to finish this class with the library and have all their books back." Because I buy half and then I check half out. Barbara.
I I wanted to comment that my neighbor who lives across the street from me, I was chatting with her a little bit on her driveway, and she was taking a box full of purchases that she had made to give to Asheville, North Carolina. And
Oh.
that inspired me so much. And she was saying, oh, it's just not enough or whatever. I said, you're giving and it means a lot. And
Mhm.
so what I did is I came in and I saw a solicitation on my email asking for that very thing for help and money. And so I can do that. And so I did. And I just I think it just inspired me to
Mhm.
give, whereas maybe I would not have had I not had that little encounter with my neighbor who was doing that very thing.
Yeah.
They're just about wiped out there.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's so sad.
Um, so one of the areas, it's about 20 miles east of Asheville, is a place called Montreat, and it's at the top of a mountain. It's a Presbyterian conference center and college. And right down below that is a town called Black Mountain, and people from all over go to Black Mountain. And these were places that were really, really hard hit. And Black Mountain Presbyterian has been serving 1,000 meals a day uh,
Oh,
since Saturday to folks. So,
that's
yes,
great.
I, I mean, that is lived compassion. They're in the midst of all the suffering themselves, but they had the ability to serve their neighbors, and so they took that. Um,
It's wonderful.
Mhm.
so thinking about compassion in the heart, and we're going to talk a lot more about compassion in the heart in upcoming sessions. But what are your thoughts? Any thoughts on compassion in the heart from what we were just talking about?
So I think that what they said was about suffering.
Hmm.
I know that when I am looking at someone else and feeling compassion for them, I guess it starts with empathy for me, but
Hmm.
I use my own experiences of suffering as a reference point to
Yeah.
try to understand what they are going through. And sometimes it's very different in that they have suffered in a very different way, but that's
Yeah,
how it links together for me.
beautiful.
I always think of suffering when people lose somebody and they're suffering. I always tell them, I hear what you're saying, I can feel, but I can't go through what you're going through because each one of us goes through suffering,
Mhm.
especially in loss, in different ways. And to say, "Oh, I understand what you mean," and I understand how you're feeling. No, we don't.
Recognizing the uniqueness of each situation.
Mm-hmm.
In the chat, Rebecca said you have to show up. Jana said we come alongside someone to weep with those who weep. Yes. And Carmony says, doesn't it depend on how one processes trauma or loss, head or heart? Yes. And I would argue you've got to process it in all three centers to really integrate that trauma or loss. Um, but we all, just by nature of who we are as individuals, we all tend toward a different center of knowing, whether I tend towards a head center. And so I have to remind myself through different practices to drop into my heart and to feel things in my body, not just think about them with my mind. So I think it's important to take whatever is happening and to process it through all three centers. Our own suffering enables us to be more compassionate. I had a friend who would say if anyone was judgmental, they had not suffered enough. Yes, or not processed that suffering. And Autumn, yes, exactly. Job's three friends sit with him for 3 days. That is lived compassion. And how often do we think, oh, there's nothing I can do, so I'm just going to hang back, when really just presence. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
that's that's what matters. And we can all do that. All right. So I will get into our final center, which is the body. So we need to cultivate a compassion that is powerful enough to make us feel committed to bringing about the well-being of others, so that we are actually willing to shoulder the responsibility for making this happen. And I think that's what we were just talking about. How do we take this concept that's out there and bring it in so that it really does move us and change us? And we're willing to take those actions. So I did a lot of Christian reading. I did a lot of just kind of straight compassion reading, but then I also did some Buddhist reading. And there is something called Lojong, and I apologize. I When you read things, never hear them pronounced. You don't always know how they are pronounced, but the basic message of Lojong, this Tibetan Buddhist slogan, is that if it's painful, you can learn to hold your seat and move closer to that pain. So, our usual pattern is to run away, split, escape, but we want to reverse that, to go against the grain and hold your seat, to stay where it's painful. And Lojong introduces a different attitude toward unwanted stuff. If it's painful, you must become willing not just to endure it, but also to let it awaken your heart and soften you. You learn to embrace it. Uh, we can use everything that we encounter. There is nothing in life that is worthless or meaningless. We can use it all to transform us, or to do the opposite. Uh, oh, I thought I had another slide there. I apologize. Um, so, and we're going to get into this more next week when we talk about loving God, or compassion through loving God. Before I get to that, suffering leads us to become more humble. It's easier to be compassionate from a place of humility than from hubris. Yes, exactly. Yes, and that is talked a lot about in the compassion book. And we'll talk about more of that when we get to loving our neighbors. Um, so in the Bible, whether it's the Old Testament or the New Testament, uh, there are certain words used for compassion. And in the Old Testament, there's one word, and it's rachum, Rakhum, and I'll have this all on slides for next week. And so that's the Hebrew word for being compassionate. And it's really this sense of being moved. It is not just like oh, it's a feeling. It's a sense of deep in your body, you are being moved. And what's really interesting is that the word in Hebrew, rachum, is very, very close to the word for womb, which is rechem. So in Hebrew, all Hebrew words are made up of three root letters. So they're kind of the pillars, and then you have vowels added to the letters to change the words, and you can add endings and things like that for different parts of speech. But every Hebrew word starts from a root word of three letters. So the word for compassion and the word for womb come from that exact same three-letter root word, and just the vowels are changed. So that tells us that this compassion is really born out of security, because that's what we find in the womb, protection, and deep, deep care and love. So that's where this body sense of compassion can be born out of. And we see that in the New Testament as well. There are actually two different words in Greek that are used for compassion. And one is kind of more of that, oh, it's compassion, or pity or mercy, or things like that. And that's oiktirmos. And that's kind of our standard feelings and actions of compassion. But then there are times, so when we're talking about compassion, that's what gets used. But when people are feeling compassion, especially Jesus is feeling compassion when he looks out at the 5,000 who have been following and are hungry and need to be fed, he was moved with compassion. And it's this great word, it's splachnon. And it kind of sounds kind of phlegmy there. It's because he was moved. Please forgive me. He was moved in his bowels. Like that's where it happens, that our guts clench. So Friday, or when I heard about this hurricane devastating a place that I love, I could feel it deep in my gut. And I was moved and started brainstorming, where can I give? How can I help? Who can I reach out to? So, thinking about those things. So, this compassion really is lodged within our bodies. Okay, there are a few things. Let's hear. When I see someone fall, I feel it in my body as if I have fallen. Janice, that happens to me too. Like literally, if my kids would hurt something, I would feel it on myself in that same place. Um, Oh, so Beryl, yes, Episcopal Relief and Development is a great place to give. If you don't have any other organizations that you're connected to, the American Red Cross is another one. There are you could also give to World Central Kitchen there in Asheville and in Florida, feeding people. So there are lots and lots of ways that we can respond. Let me find. So I'm curious, we're going to move. We do have time for practice. I didn't talk too much. Is anyone familiar with the Ignatian examen practice? Is that something that I've seen some nods? Somewhat. It's one of those practices that I always want to do very, very regularly, and I do somewhat regularly. But it's something good. You can do it theoretically every evening, but if you forget in the evening and fall asleep, you can do it in the morning. It still works then. Um, so the basics of the examen it has a focus, and what it does is it asks you to review the day, and you can take lots of different perspectives. Can I type the name in the chat? Yes. Spell
I
check was not helping me change ignition into ignition. Okay. Um, So it's a guided practice of reviewing your day, and especially looking for where God was present, where you might have gone astray, and then you can bring different lenses to it. I have this great book called Reimagining the Ignatian Examen, and it brings lots of different lenses. So I thought we could do a compassion lens, but I'll talk you through the steps before we get started. All right. So we start, uh, it's got 5 steps. You start by giving thanks because every day is a gift from God and God is always present with us. And so we give thanks and rejoice in the blessings that we have seen each day, and there are always blessings to be seen. The second step is to ask for the Holy Spirit to be present in our reflection. And to bring to mind, oh, there is a free app that's based on that book. You're right, Joe, and I have that on my phone also. So ask for the Spirit to bring to mind those days when you might not have acted so well, when you did not quite follow God's path as well. Uh, but for the Spirit to reveal those. And this is not a time for shame or self-flagellation, but to look at them. The third step is to review and recognize these failures and just to recognize, to be aware, to hold them out, and then to ask for forgiveness and healing, so that when we're aware of something, we bring it from that unconscious level up to the conscious level. And when it's in that conscious level, then we can process it, we can be healed from it, and then move on, and then pray about the next day and ask God to help show you where where you might be led the next day, how you might interact with people. If there are difficult people that will be there in your life, how can you be present with them? And then we end in prayer. So this is, we are using the one for persons. So I invite you to again get comfortable in your seat, relaxed yet present, and just start by slowly breathing. And this time, I invite you to give thanks for all the blessings of this day, for those times when you felt the Spirit's presence with you in your interactions, those shimmers of joy when you saw God's face. What are you thankful for today? Now ask God to show you each person you encounter today. And then from those people you encountered, Ask God to reveal which encounter was the most important. What had the strongest impact on you or the other person? It could be a negative or a positive encounter. And zoom in on that one encounter. How were you in that encounter? Were you helpful? Were you reactionary? Were you present or were you in a trance? Did any emotions take over in that encounter? What were the consequences of your interactions with that person, with how you behaved either in a positive or neutral or negative way? If it was a positive encounter, what good came from it? If there was good, relish it and thank God for that. If it was more of a negative encounter, what bad came from it? Allow yourself to feel the pain of this and ask God for forgiveness and healing. Now look to the future. When might you encounter this person again? And what are your great desires for that relationship? Allow those great desires to well up within you and place them in God's hands and ask God to make them holy. Ask God to show you what grace or virtue you need to be the person you want to be in this relationship, and ask for that. If you feel called to do so, you may make a resolution to be the kind of person you feel called to be in the relationships upon which you have reflected in this examen. Amen. As we close tonight, I like to ask, is there a word or a phrase that has stood out for you this night? It could be something that was said or something that activated in your mind or your heart. And you can put it in the chat, you can share it verbally. But what what has spoken to you this evening? What do you want to take away from our time together? Hmm. Not Autumn said, not power or prestige that is important, but connection with others, that you can be changed through spiritual practice. Compassion is strength, not weakness. Wonderful. Using head, heart, and body. Yeah. Sitting with your suffering. That's a hard one, especially for us Westerners to do. Oh, the picture of the brain. Thanks, Susan. The Latin roots of compassion to suffer with. Thank you, Fernando. The quote from Pema on how we have to sit with the pain in order to awaken the heart. Opportunity for spiritual growth. Yes. Be present, not on autopilot. Yeah. I am going to put a link in the chat with find the right page. Some spiritual practices. Um, I have a lot of tabs open. So a great place to start is Tara Brock. Tara, so her name is Tara. She's a DC local. Um, Barbara, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you if you could email those of us who are in the group to send us the names of the book and the author that you're referring to. Because if it's just in a chat, then I've got to think about that too much. And so I
Yes,
would really appreciate that,
yes.
Liz.
I will definitely be doing that.
Thank you.
But if people wanted to get started before the email comes out, I put so one of the books that I've been using is Radical Compassion. This is a great book.
Mhm.
And so she has a website, and I pulled up her compassion page. There's some resources, there are videos, there are practices on there. This is more of a general, she pulls from the Christian tradition, pulls from the Buddhist tradition also, but very much from the Christian tradition.
Mhm.
But it is not strictly Christian. And I'll be giving more Christian practices as we go through the weeks, but that's a great place to start as well. Carrie put that the word that ran through her head was visceral as it relates to the body, that the act of compassion, oh, that will make it look different for her. Beautiful. And I wanted to close. This was a fun book that I checked out of the library. It's called Heart to Heart, A Conversation on Love and Hope for a Precious Planet by the Dalai Lama. And as you can see, uh, it's actually a picture book. Uh, it's got lots of like every page just has a few words and it has a lot of illustrations, but it's a beautiful book.
I have that book.
Oh,
Yeah, I do.
well, just go pull it out and read it again.
Well, I've been reading it in the mornings when I've done the uh, Thomas Keating.
Hmm. Hmm.
I've done that like every day
Careful.
meditation, but I'd kind of like to move on to something else, and I dug out that very book you were mentioning, and it's got good things in it too.
It does. Olive asked to briefly outline the 4 weeks. Today was introduction. Next week, we're talking about loving God and what that looks like as a practice. The week after that is loving ourselves. And then the week after that is loving our neighbor. So we're um, following the greatest commandment that Jesus lays out. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So this is heart to heart. Um, it's just a sweet little book that I found at the library. So a prayer, it has some longer and shorter snippets of wisdom. So our our wisdom to close. May I become at all times, both now and forever, a protector for those without protection, a guide for those who have lost their way, a ship for those with oceans to cross, a bridge for those with rivers to cross, a sanctuary for those in danger, a lamp for those without light, a place of refuge for those who lack shelter, and a servant to all in need.
Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you, friends, for being here. I'll see you next week.